Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. Some people liked my latest video about Quilcerar, so I thought it might be fun to start a whole series about some of the more iconic weapons in the Warcraft universe. I'm calling it the Azeroth Arsenal, and what better way to start it with none other than Thunderfury, the blessed blade of the Windseeker. Being one of the first legendaries released back in vanilla, is quite possibly one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic weapon in the entire game. To get it back then, you needed 3 things: luck, 39 friends, and a lot of gold. But before we get into how to actually obtain it, we should first talk about the history and lore behind the weapon to get a good understanding of why it's epic, or legendary I guess. I'll give a very abridged retelling. Simply put, it's the weapon of the former prince of all wind elementals, Thunderaan. A very long time ago, before the time of man, Azeroth was the stage of an all-out war between the 4 elemental lords: Ragnaros the Fire Lord, Alakir the Wind Lord, Neptulon the Tide Hunter, and Therazane the Stone Mother. Their itinerary was basically to keep Azeroth in a perpetual state of chaos and destruction. Why? Well, why not? Actually, it was because there was a 5th element, Spirit, that was being consumed by the world soul Azeroth. This sent everything off balance, and as a result, the remaining elementals became quite violent. It's sort of like Captain Planet, with Spirit as heart. So, these elemental lords were at constant war with one another, and were free to do as they pleased until the old gods arrived. Being far more powerful, the elemental lords allied together in light of a common enemy. But it wasn't enough. They were defeated, and were swiftly enslaved by the old gods, and became tools to be used. The Pantheon would eventually arrive and defeat the old gods and put the elemental lords in timeout basically, and imprison them in their own elemental planes. The Firelands for Ragnaros and all of the fire elementals, Deepholm for Therazane and her earth elementals, Skywall for Alakir and his winds, and the Abyssal Maw for Neptulon and his waters. No longer having that common enemy, the elemental lords continued their war with each other, and a battle called the Elemental Sundering took place. It was a 5,000-year war between 2 main belligerents, Ragnaros and Alakir. Ragnaros wasn't playing fair though. He had his 2 lieutenants, Baron Geddon and Gar, deceive and betray the prince of the air elementals, Thunderaan. They lured him into a trap where he was struck down by Ragnaros and his weapon, Sulfuras. We'll talk about that one in another episode. Ragnaros consumed much of Thunderaan's essence and became far more powerful, but he saved some for later. He stored what little remained of Thunderaan's essence in 2 special artifacts, the Bindings of the Windseeker. These were placed in the hands of his trusted lieutenants, Gar and Geddon, where they would patrol the caverns of the Molten Core to protect Ragnaros during his slumber. So, these 2 bindings, although it's just a small portion of his essence, hold incredible power and would be key in creating a weapon capable of harnessing the Fallen Prince's power. Which brings us to the events of World of Warcraft. The first 2 raids in the game were Onyxia's Lair and the Molten Core, the dawn of raiding in World of Warcraft. That's right, no longer were you with 4 others strolling through a dungeon. You were with 39 other people working together to make it through this ultimate challenge. At this point in the game, even epic items were very rare. So not just an epic, but rather a legendary was, well, legendary. They required a lot of luck and dedication, and only a very small percentage of the player base would ever get them. Even to this day, 13 years later, Thunderfury is still only held by a small percentage of the player base. So, how did you get it? Well, Geddon and Gar were both bosses in the Molten Core, which held a whopping 10 bosses total, ending with Ragnaros himself. There were different orders in which you could defeat the bosses, but they were generally the 4th and 6th bosses respectively in the raid that people killed. So, fairly deep within the area. They were quite difficult during the time, mainly because, like I said, this was one of the first raids. People for the most part had no idea what they were doing, and it was chaos. But eventually, people started getting the hang of things and were able to take them down. They dropped several epic purple items as a reward, and a very, very small chance to drop a binding of the Windseeker, the artifact Ragnaros had entrusted to them long ago. Baron Geddon dropped the left binding, and Gar dropped the right binding. The flavor text reads, "The left and right halves of Thunderaan's eternal prison." One player needed to get both of these to be able to start the process to obtaining Thunderfury. Another thing I should say is that this was also back when people used Dragon Killing Points, or DKP for short. Like I said, with 40 people in one raid, it was chaos, and this point system was a way to try and have an orderly way of distributing items to all 40 of these players. You would earn these points by killing bosses, and then spend them on items. And with Thunderfury being equipable by every class who could hold a sword, there was a lot of competition. If your guild was smart though, they would limit it preferably to warrior tanks and maybe DPS rogues since they got the most use out of it, but like I said, no one knew what they were doing back then, so even hunters would get it in some cases. So you would raid the Molten Core weekly, hope and pray that the bindings drop, and hope and pray that you have more DKP than everyone else. If you managed to get both bindings, you went to the high-level Silithus zone and talked to an NPC named the High Lord Demetrian. He asks you to examine a Vessel of Rebirth, which would later be used to summon the Elemental Lord, Prince Thunderaan, once more. If you brought the right materials, that is. To do this, you needed 4 things: the left binding, the right binding, the Essence of the Fire Lord, which is dropped by Ragnaros, the final boss of the Molten Core, and 10 legendary enchanted Elementium bars. So, we have the bindings covered pretty thoroughly. As for the Essence of the Fire Lord though, this was quite hard to obtain as you would imagine. Ragnaros, being the final boss, was appropriately the hardest out of any of the encounters in the raid, and your guild needed to be on top of their game to take him down. You couldn't skip right to him either. You had to kill all 9 other bosses and extinguish the ruins near them before you unlocked the NPC that summoned Ragnaros. Luckily though, the essence was a 100% drop rate, so there was no luck involved there, just skill. Remember earlier when I said that one of the 3 things you needed was a lot of gold? Well, that's where these enchanted Elementium bars came into play. To make these, you needed 3 Elementium Flux, which you could buy from vendors at 3 gold each, so 30 total, which was 90 raw gold. That was nothing to sneeze at back then. But we're just getting started. You also needed the rare Fiery Core reagent, so 10 total for 10 bars. These dropped from the Molten Core, and if your guild was nice, they'd usually supply you with this. Otherwise, you'd have to buy them off of the auction house. You also needed 10 Arcanite bars for each enchanted bar, so 100 total. These were a high-end crafting reagent used in many endgame weapons and armor. They needed 1 thorium bar, which miners made, and another item called Arcanite crystals, which you rarely got from thorium veins. And to top it all off, only an alchemist could transmute the bars once a day, and they would also charge a fee for that too. And once again, you needed 100 of these. The last item you needed was something called an Elementium Ingot. These were rare drops from the next raid, the Blackwing Lair, which was even harder than the Molten Core. You needed 1 for each bar, so 10 total. Once again, very expensive and hard to get. For most players, they would basically have to rely on their guild for supplying most of these materials because it was just too expensive for one person to handle. And if that wasn't enough, even smelting these bars was a challenge by itself. To learn the recipe, you had to find a special NPC in the Blackwing Lair raid named the Master Elemental Shaper Crixix, who was behind 4 bosses in the raid. You had to have one of your priests mind control him, and if you talked to him, he would teach you how to smelt these enchanted Elementium bars. So, after a lot of work, you had your bindings, your essence, and your bars. Returning these to Demetrian allowed you to summon the fallen prince himself, Thunderaan. So, you of course would want your entire guild present, unless you were into getting one-shotted by elemental lords. You would battle the Windseeker, and if you were successful, he would leave behind his weapon, the orange dormant wind-kissed blade. Using it would start a quest called Rise Thunderfury, where you would force Demetrian to use the materials you provided to infuse the weapon with power, turning it to Thunderfury, the blessed blade of the Windseeker. It had a high DPS with a very fast 1.9 speed, agility, stamina, some resistances, and a nice proc that deals damage and slows attack speed of targets hit. As I said, it was preferable to give this to rogues for damage and warrior tanks for better tanking. Honestly, probably warrior tanks were the best because it was the perfect tanking weapon throughout all of vanilla, and tanks even used it for a while in the next expansion, the Burning Crusade. Although as a vanilla rogue, I didn't want to admit that back then. So, that's the story of Thunderfury. It's a little more epic than getting a legendary from Blingtron, isn't it? Like I said, one of the most iconic weapons in the game. You'll see it linked in trade chat all the time. You get a feat of strength if you obtain it, and it had its own card in the TCG and was re-released as an artifact model for Outlaw Rogues and the Legion expansion. Maybe this is Blizzard saying that it was a rogue weapon after all. And it was also part of the Shaman Order Hall questline, where you get Prince Thunderaan as a follower. You pick up the blade from the corpse of a nameless adventurer. You could even find it outside of the game in Diablo 3, Blizzard's action RPG game. Certainly one of the coolest weapons in the game, even to this date in my opinion. Certainly worthy of an episode in the Azeroth arsenal. So, that's about it for this one. Let me know if you think I should continue this series. I think it has a lot of potential. There are lots of cool weapons and even armor in the game that have interesting stories behind them, just like Thunderfury. If you have any in particular that you want to see next, throw some suggestions my way. I'm making a big list right now, so I'll be writing down any requests if you guys have any. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Like it if you liked it, and thanks for watching. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.